Hello, very beautiful community. Let me know if you can hear me, and then we're going to have a little personal question and answer session together. First live in a long time because I have experienced a health deterioration. And it's in part for that reason that I'm with you in a sort of a slightly fake capacity today. Not fake in the sense of inauthentic. I'm very authentic. Can you see that? You can see that. You can see my authenticity. Yes, you can. But the slightly fake capacity is just this business when you have chronic health that's got worse of being out in the open waters. Remember this analogy from our democracies, but pretending you're on the beach. So I'm fake in the sense that I'm pretending I'm on the beach when I'm a bit in the open waters. But that does not mean I am inauthentically with you. I'm very authentically with you. And we're going to keep all of our chat today to personal questions. They can be personal questions about politics, right? They can be things you are struggling with politics, but they're not going to be political analysis. I mean, in the next few days, hopefully we'll have some shorter chats on this channel that are more analytical. Now, I'm very keen, very committed to go through some of the questions that have been left before on the assumption that you can still see and hear me, which it looks like you can. We're hopefully going to be a smaller group today because it's so clearly advertised that we're having an atypical conversation. So let's go. What do we see at the top? Ross, do you think the approach you've taken in your videos has changed over the years? And if so, how? I am a big believer in two hats. That if you have an intellectual hat on, that putting on a public intellectual hat is a second hat. It's not just an extension of the first hat. The reason I believe that, and when I say I believe it, I say that it's right for me, is that you put truth first. You put what's true first when you engage as an intellectual. When you engage as a public intellectual, you don't put truth first, you put your audience's relationship with truthfulness first. Different emphases, right? There's a certain sense in which I start with you in that capacity as a public intellectual. And so what's changed for me is that I have grown as somebody who wears the public intellectual hat because of you. You have helped me grow from an 11-year-old public intellectual to now perhaps a 14, 15-year-old public intellectual. And, you know, as we continue, I might become 17 very soon. And that doesn't mean that I've changed my mind about anything, about how this works. What it means is that I have developed a more three-dimensional understanding of how this works and how to give and what giving means and even what love means, right? I say that word a lot. What's the point of saying that word to a bunch of strangers? Isn't it just kitsch? Well, no, it isn't. There's 77 different kinds of love, and there is such a thing as love in leadership. And I'm not doing any leadership here unless you think of thought leadership as leadership, which sounds a little bit like it's pushing it to me. But leadership, right, in politics, when it's constructive, requires love. It doesn't mean you personally know the people you love, but it means that there's a certain kind of relation where you're both putting people first, but also at the same time challenging them, right? And these are the sorts of balances that I've grown into expressing and manifesting more compellingly over time. As an intellectual, you tend to prepare a meal and you expect everybody at the table to eat it in the right order. As a public intellectual, you give a buffet because a lot of people are going to be coming in and they're going to be eating your tomato salad. And it might be that you've only spent 4% of your time on that tomato salad because you've also made a potato salad, you've made a few bakes, you've made a few desserts, but most people are not picking that. Um, and that's okay. That's normal. That's how it works, right? So, funnily enough, love is also to do with being honest about the inevitable degree of miscommunication in this enterprise. So that's just a taster of it. I've basically grown rather than changed my mind. Miss you nothing. Vlad, you talk about being still optimistic about the future despite the ecological crisis and the democratic degeneration. Doomerism is popular. How are you optimistic? I'm primarily optimistic for two reasons. One is that I base my expectations not on the recent past, but on the past in general. Relative to the 1989 till 2001 bubble, where we are now is bad and it's going to get worse. So it's really not pretty. Relative to general human history, it's relatively okay. Where we are is really relatively okay. It's just a lot worse than the recent past because we were privileged with a quite a lucky bubble in the West in the recent past. So I think of the past as my parameter of comparison, not the recent past. And the second thing is that I love human beings as they are. That doesn't mean I love the destructive consequences of human conduct mediated by institutions we share. But what it means is that my fundamental instinct is not to make human beings something they're not so we could have a better world. I love the world as it is. That's what I start with. I have no misanthropic emotions at all. Oh my God, humans are loathsome because of that and this. I have no depressive emotions about what we are. But that's not because I have an optimistic view of what we are. It's because I am in love with us for the beautiful and destructive animals that we are. Jochen is saying, I want to write a fiction book, but this appears challenging while having a traditional career. You can write a pop fiction book in and around your life if you push hard. If you want to write something that is more expressive and has more of an aesthetic dimension, has more elements of what some people would call art, I'm not going to privilege that definition now. You need isolation. There's a book by Anthony Storr called Solitude that he wrote perhaps in the 80s, maybe in the 90s. It's a wonderful book about the healthiness of aloneness for creative people. You can't get around the fact that with certain enterprises like writing a book, if it's a book of fiction, you're probably, if you want to write something really expressive and meaningful, going to need a lot of time alone. That might require money, quite frankly. And I think it's hard to get around that. Depending on your age, I would recommend different levels of recklessness of creating that space, creating that time for you. The younger you are, the more reckless you can be. The more commitments you have with family, the harder this is. There is an inherent conflict between serious fiction and indeed philosophy too, but that's a separate conversation. We might get to it because there's a couple of questions I can see on that. But there's an inherent conflict between fiction and family life, I'm afraid to say. And so this is going to require quite a bit of selfishness. And so one of the questions might be, is it worth it, right? Is it an important part of who you are? And what's the contribution that you hope to make? And there's always risk there, right? You can write something and it turns out to be better than you expect. or it turns out to be worse than you expect. So to some extent, you can never guarantee this. It's always a gamble, and it's healthy that that's a gamble, because that's life. And you might be indeed ethically judged for that. In other words, if you take a lot of time from your other commitments and love commitments to do this, it might be that you come out ethically better from the whole story if what you write is good, and you come out ethically worse from the whole story if you take this time away, take this step, the selfish step potentially, and then generate something that's mediocre. And that's moral luck, which way it turns out for you. The younger you are, the fewer commitments you have, the easier it is for you to take these reckless steps. Julia is saying YouTube sucks big time. Any thoughts? Well, you know my thoughts about the information space as we find it and the polarizing, disinhibiting nature of it. At the moment, my channel is struggling with a thing called invalid traffic, which means that YouTube has decided that a tiny bit of my traffic, maybe just on one video, has come from a source it doesn't like. It could be some bots behaving badly toward my channel. It could be an innocent, beautiful member of the community finding some dodgy website in Mongolia or the Philippines and putting a video of mine on there benignly. That could be the problem. And that at the moment is creating a bit of uncertainty around really what's the well the monetization side of the channel, but also potentially the views side of it too. YouTube say this can affect views, and it's not clear how I can transact the problem, even though it's clear that I didn't do anything to cause it. Much more to say about YouTube issues later. Niels, I've been reflecting on the YouTube comments section, and my observation is that it's a place where you can often do not much more than shout or do what the algorithm encourages. And it enforces a certain type of conversation, which leaves me with a feeling of shouting into a void. I think that the biggest issue in any kind of online engagement has to be your own mental health. If you're physically well, you don't have any illness, you don't have to worry about it impacting your physical health. Then you worry about it impacting your mental health, and you don't do it if it impacts your mental health negatively. Then there are two questions. You participate for the sake of participation, that gives you something, or you get something out of it, of expressing your views, exchanging. And you say to yourself, well, is the way I'm doing it and where am I doing it, is that constructive or destructive for me? First question. Second question, you may want to engage online not for the sake of engaging, but for the sake of understanding what the online space is, that it's such a big part of our society and our democracies. So I am interested in what's going on platforms, irrespective of whether I'm on them to share anything or not, because I'm keen to see how human beings are engaging and what's going on there. I would say boundaries are very important in how you communicate online. And in particular, this sort of subtle toxic feeling of persistently finding yourself doing something you have decided you shouldn't do, right? Let's say you decided that, and it could be something innocent. Let's say you decided that you're never going to write 7 paragraphs and invest 20 minutes into leaving an article on Twitter or a long comment on YouTube. Then don't do that. Yeah. If your commitment is that you're going to write a couple of sentences here and there, then do so. Have your own picture of what is constructive exchange. If what's happening isn't constructive exchange, don't do it. Don't participate in meaningless exchange of slogans. It's not going to elevate you. That's not an answer, but it's just a couple of brief reflections to get us going. Pandemonium meltdown. Losing trust in the job market is hardest for me. Employers all feel like dictators, workers feel like slaves, rights feel like they're eroding, finances are bankrupting, struggle feels real and painful. Might is right in the unchallengeable job market. So, my thought here is that a societal perspective and a first personal perspective on societal issues are not reducible to one another, and that's important. So, let me give you a couple of examples. I have a chronic illness. That means that the medical profession is either amazing at handling me or terrible. And it's both 95% terrible, 5% amazing. If I see a doctor who's getting some things wrong, I'll give you an example. Let's say a doctor doesn't understand how to conceptualize a particular chronic illness. So I say, hang on, this is my chronic illness. I am having some worries about, let's say, my heart health. What are your thoughts about this? And the doctor says, well, because I don't know much about your chronic illness, I'm just going to assume that your heart health is going to be statistically similar to a healthy person's. But that's not to conceptualize the illness, because to conceptualize the illness is to ask the question, well, is this particular chronic illness going to create heart problems for people over time, or is it not? And if it does, to what extent are they going to be looking different heart health wise to healthy people? That's a conceptualization of the illness. Let's say the doctor fails to do this. I'm going somewhere with this, don't worry. I can sit there and say, the medical profession's systemic prejudices are oppressing me. Or I can say, Rachel, my doctor, is on this occasion perhaps not quite seeing something I'd like her to see. So let me see if I can help her see it. You see the difference? Give you another example. I saw a panel not long ago, or maybe long ago, with Salman Rushdie and a female film director speaking. And inadvertently, Salman just dominated the panel, and more or less didn't let the woman speak. Now, if you asked me sociologically what's going on, I would say, yeah, there is quite a bit of gendered power there. What's an example of gendered power? An example of gendered power is the fact that male charisma is more easily communicable than female charisma. There's plenty of gendered power dynamics. But if you are the woman, and I happen to be the woman's friend, and we're going for a coffee, and she says, well, what happened, do you think, Vlad, with me on that panel? I didn't like the experience. Felt like Salman just rode roughshod over me without intending to do so. He just laughed and giggled and spoke over me. He wasn't malign in any way, but it just ended up that he dominated the whole story. I would say, look, yes, there are some structural issues of gendered power there, but you can't reduce your first personal experience of the panel to that. That's to say, you inevitably have to ask yourself questions. Well, what can I do to shut Salman up? Maybe as a woman, it's harder for me than it would be for you, Vlad, because you could sit there and say, Salman, be quiet, close your mouth, don't speak. I will speak now, and I love you, you're fantastic. But 2 minutes, you close your mouth. I am speaking. You are listening. Now, as a male, as a white male, especially, I can get away with that very easily. In fact, most of you, if you saw this be done by me with a little bit of charisma and lightheartedness, it would both have the effect of giving Salman the sign that he needs to give me a bit of space to say some things. And it also not challenge your pre-existing impression of me as somebody who has integrity, who isn't a bully, and who is warm. That's harder for a woman to perform that kind of maneuver in public with a big audience of strangers. Sure, gendered power differences, but that doesn't get you out of a conversation. Well, how could you have handled this panel better so that you did get more space, right? So that you weren't sort of, ridden roughshod over by Salman Rushdie. And so what I'm saying is that structural explanations of what's wrong are valid, but they're explanations from the vantage point, from the interest of understanding how society works and how structural injustices in society work. But you can't allow your first personal perspective to be entirely consumed by that explanation because they're not reducible to one another. So, in the first personal explanation, you can't just say, all employers are terrible, the system is rigged, nothing works. It has to be much more about what are you doing to develop yourself, what are you doing to advance yourself, and what are you doing in each particular case to have a situation where you have a more constructive employer and where you have a more constructive relationship with your employer. So it's always got to be both, and there's a risk of denying the structural issues, but there's also a risk of passivity that is triggered by a kind of substitution of first personal decision making and first personal aspiration for this big picture. And you've got to have both. It's very important that big picture story, even if it's true, doesn't just drown out your individual enterprise, if you like, of going around the world and making your way in the job market. So you don't want to be somebody glib who just denies structural disadvantage, but you also don't want to be somebody who speaks about your own experience in the discourse of some kind of literary theory or sociological theory seminar, because that's going to make you passive and it's going to further reinforce, in a kind of self-perpetuating way, a kind of passivity, right? So you're going to make this big sociological story truer than it needs to be in your own life if you just speak about your experience in terms of it. If that doesn't make sense, I think it's a really important question. I'd love to come back to it and maybe be more articulate about it. Julia is asking, Dear Vlad, can you consider a visit to a healer and trust in a miracle? So, in general, I am somebody who believes in a scientific worldview. A scientific worldview is very different from the view that science has all the answers we need today, or has even all the relevant modes for the answers we need today. But the problem is, if you challenge a scientific explanation and you say, well, it's a bunch of baloney, how are you going to challenge it? The only way to challenge it is to create a different picture of the world with human beings in it going about their affairs in various ways. So what happens? You revert back to a scientific picture of the world as you try to critique a particular scientific view, a particular scientific position. So any reflection via which you challenge science necessarily forces you back into a scientific worldview. And I don't think there is a way of getting out of that. Therefore, in the realm of medicine, I don't believe in miracles. But I absolutely believe in various kinds of open-mindedness about things that current medicine does badly or doesn't even conceptualize how to do properly. That's just the beginning of an answer. Banana Joe, dear Vlad, I'm 40. And I've been battling various illnesses for half of my life, not fatal, but painful, and also mild depressions cropping up. I'm trying to get my life under control and have achieved already quite a few goals. Unfortunately, I'm always being held back or thrown for health reasons. That frustrates me. I mean, that's brutally contingent and unfair, but it's also real. I want to talk more about this on the Vlad's Me Diary YouTube channel. One of the things I always say about the limitations that a health condition imposes on you is is that you have to dance with them rather than be in a rigid relationship with them, and that you have to explore always what is possible, not because it could prove to be true that the limitations are in your head and they aren't real, they're real, but because you can always explore what more there is that you could do to enrich yourself, fulfill yourself, then it seems possible. I mean, even this right now is a very trivial example. Look, um, I am having some quite extreme symptoms now, and I have so many years of experience dealing with them that I have a different response to them than a healthy person would if they got them overnight. If I were fully well and I began to feel like I feel right now overnight, I wouldn't be speaking to a a community of people in person or online. I'd be in bed. But I have so much experience. I'm fortunate that my mental health is extraordinary. My mental resilience, which is different to mental health. Mental resilience is an easier thing having to sort out than mental health. I'm fortunate with these things. And, as a result, right now I've made the decision that I may not be able to fully vertically sit up in a chair and do a Q&A. I've also made the decision that I may not be able to do a politics Q&A on a level that would satisfy me, that would feel like I can give you enough. So that's why we're talking personally right now. That's an example of exploration of what is possible. At the end of his life, Chris Hitchens wrote a book on mortality, which sort of peters out as his health declines. And I think, unless I'm making it up, there are bits there where he is doing public events while managing rather extreme health that he sort of hides. And that kind of too is an exploration of what is possible. You should never push yourself in a destructive way that makes you crash. But there's always an exploration of what is possible. I mean, and I'm exploring that right now in this very conversation. Michael, I'm desperately lonely. I'm 70 years old. I live in the heart of San Francisco. I have a lifelong struggle with severe anxiety and depression um, that are under control with meds compounded by isolation. Michael, you're just sharing that. I'm not sure there are words that I can adequately say, but I think one question is sort of physical health allowing, what's a journey from 70 to 80? That's a journey about faith in the possibility that things could be better for you. And that faith may be a kind of faith that is about not yet being able to touch any way in which things could be better, but yet having the conviction that you could somehow discover that. You can discover some ways that things could be better that you can't quite touch yet. And that's an exploration. It requires faith. Faith is about bridging the present with the future under conditions of uncertainty. Virtually completely inadequate what I've said, but that journey from 70 till 80 is something I'd be really fascinated by. Something that you sort of dance through and think of on a single long breath, with some sense of growth and progress through that period, even if all of it seems impossible from where you sit now. Anya, hi Anya, can you tell me about your musical education, your teachers, and so on? So this is extremely limited and slow, but for those of you who love classical music, I will be sharing content, hopefully, just as soon as I make 10-20% more progress coming out of this latest health setback on Vlad Vexter Music channel. A very small toe of my professional life, I aspire to be in musicology, actually in applying language to music. I've brought very little of that into the public. In my life, I've only given one conference paper, I think, on music, which was on one of the variations of Beethoven's De Belle Variations.